My name's Sally Bothroyd. I'm the Executive Director of the NT Writers Centre, which is the small organisation that puts on this festival. And firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Aranda people, who are the traditional owners of this land and this beautiful land where we've had such a great time over the last couple of days. Okay, this last session, it's called Homecomings, Memoir and Landscapes, and I'll introduce you to our two writers who we're going to find out have an awful lot in common. First of all, Kim Mahood, who is no stranger to Alice Springs, as she actually went to primary school here. She's written 2 memoirs, but is also a non-fiction writer, a poet, and better known possibly as an artist. Next we have Agustinus Wibowo, who's visiting Alice for the first time from Indonesia, although it's not his first visit to Australia, and it's definitely not his first visit to a strange land. He's a traveller of many, many, many years. He's written several books in the travel genre, but has had his first published in English recently. It's entitled Zero, When the Journey Takes You Home. He's also a bit of an artist in that he's a photographer. We're going to start this session with the topic memoir, and then we'll move on to landscapes, and finally we'll come to homecoming. So Kim, I'm going to start the ball rolling with you. Your first memoir was Craft for a Dry Lake. What led you back into the fold of a second memoir? Position Doubtful, I should say the name of the book, which is available, of course.
Well, I didn't actually plan for it to be a memoir. I actually tried to write a book that wasn't first person, but there was this accumulation of material that, I leave Craft for a Dry Lake hanging, does she go back or does she not go back, which was a bit disingenuous because by the time it was published I'd already been going back, but for the sake of literary kind of coherence, I left it, and so by the time 15 or so years passed and I'd been sort of re-engulfed in that world, and the decision after I'd gone back and written Craft was to either sort of pull right away or become, re-enmeshed, and what would that do? And of course that process was so life-changing in a way. The reason to, in the end, go once again with the first person was probably a bit of publishing pressure for a start. There's always that preference for, a voice to lead you through, and the more sort of personal. So when I realised I'd have to do it that way, that's when I worked very much on developing a voice which people could kind of relate to, and it's not in any way a constructed or dishonest voice, but it does select out elements. There's a kind of I think in the persona a sort of periodic irritability that lots of people can relate to, that function in that world where you're never quite sure what's going on and whether you're going to manage it. And I certainly didn't do the superwoman with all the great bush skills or anything. That's just very sort of backgrounded, that you just drive out there and get on with the job. But certainly for myself to make sense of what that second phase of going back meant, and to, in the process of kind of interrogating it myself, to, I hope, also make it accessible for other people.
So you say there was some publishing pressure for memoir. Do you think that's because of a popularity in memoir at this moment, or?
Look, I think there's just a great preference for the first person voice. I mean, it's coming into journalism. I think it's got good and bad elements to it. I think there is a kind of rather, I think, unhealthy desire to hear the most unsavoury elements of people's lives. That, you know, that's the ugly part of it. But I think the really positive side is to actually engage with other people's stories, and it's much easier to understand, say, a really complex situation, be it, you know, a refugee or whatever, if you travel with an individual story rather than having a kind of overview that's much colder and more detached. So I think, like everything, it's got its pros and cons.
And we should say a bit of what your second book, Position Doubtful, is about for anyone in the audience who hasn't read it. You want to give a little précis?
Well, basically it just charts about a 25-year period of returning to the Tanami, and my first trip back was actually in 1992 after a 20-year absence, and that was the trip that gave rise to my first memoir. But in fact, the period that Position Doubtful covers starts with that 1992 return. So it's 25 years of re-engaging with a place and becoming progressively more enmeshed with the people who live there, some of whom, there was a sort of number of different white families at Tanami Downs that used to be my family home, but mostly Aboriginal people, the traditional owners, the Warlpiri traditional owners of that Tanami area, and then the families who live on Mullen community over on the in southeast Kimberley, and how I initially quite reluctantly became drawn into that world and those lives, and then how to be there in a way that was sustainable, I guess. I saw lots of unsustainable ways of doing it. Most people here probably read the essay Gutty Are Like Toyotas, which is probably the one piece of writing that will outlive me, which was just watching white fellas come in with all kinds of, good intentions, or often not good intentions, and one way or another, that sort of be shipped out in pieces, or, leave in completely demoralised, or, become entrenched in really, bad ways. So I thought, for me it was, how do I structure this so I can keep coming back? This is really important to me, but I know I can't do it full time. And so it's really about constructing a way that works, and it's, it's a pretty precarious process, just in all sorts of ways, because you are never entirely sure whether something could suddenly, come in from left field and completely derail the situation. So there's a sort of, a friend of mine described it as sort of ambient tension that is always part of that world. But it keeps you on your toes, your sort of wits are about you. I often tell a story of, a few years ago I started doing one of those brain training, keep your brain active, sort of online things. And I was out in Mullen for a couple of months, no decent internet, hadn't done it. And I thought when I got home, my scores will be way down, Well, they're off the chart. I was so much smarter after two months in the desert, where, every single minute of every single day I was processing probably, half a dozen different things simultaneously. So anybody who's worried about, encroaching senility, go and put some time in on a community.
Well, that might be a good segue to Agustinus, because as a travel writer, you've been thrown into having your wits around you. Your book's been described as a sort of a combination of travel writing and memoir. How do you see it yourself?
Okay, this is my third book in Indonesian, Zero. My first book and second book was about, maybe as a classic travel writing that you may imagine. It's about faraway land. My first book is about Afghanistan, and my second book is about Central Asia. But in the third book, I try and I experiment a little bit with the technique, a new technique of writing, because this third book is not only about my travel but also about my life story. So the story started when I returned home to Indonesia after 10 years of traveling around, that my mother was dying on the bed. She got cancer, so it was her last few days, and and I was very helpless that I could not do anything, but I just sit next to my mom, and I took my diary from faraway lands, and I read one story by one story to my mother. It's not unlike the Shahrazad in 1001 Night to prolong her life by its story. So the first time I tried to collect all of this memory, it was very painful. It was very difficult as well, and then I have to trace back to many of difficult memories that I had that I chose to, I would choose to forget, but this memory keep haunting me and then tortured me in certain way. So I decided to write, but the writing itself also was very challenging because it's about two different stories. My story when traveling far away, and the story of my mom who has never traveled anywhere, and there were also two different time dimension. I was traveling in the faraway lands, and the other time dimension is inside the hospital. I rewrote this book for 26 times. For 400 pages, and it never worked. I wrote already 300 pages, and it didn't work. I could not have an ending because at the beginning I wrote it chronologically. Until 1 year of rewriting, I realized that the only way of doing this is by combining the two plots together with the frame story, just like the 1001 Night. So a story of the one time dimension is the one in the hospital and the faraway lands. And by doing this, it's not only I can write of what happened, but then I can also contemplate on what is the connection between what is happening in the faraway lands and what is happening in the hospital room. Because I believe travel is not only we travel physically. The Buddhist, Tibetan Buddhist has saying that the further you travel physically, the deeper you go to your heart. And I realized by the contemplation when you write memoir, when you're trying to give meaning of what you experienced, of what journey you have taken, of any things that happen to you, and you start giving meaning to it, then you start going deep to your heart and see the real face of yourself that you never seen otherwise. So I gained this understanding after trying to combine of the two time dimension, and then after trying to give meaning to every journey that we have passed together. And then I realized that even though at the beginning when I started with all of the datas and the diaries, it all looks scattered. But then after you start understanding with the meaning, it became a complete whole circular story. So that's I think it was a very very brave experiment for myself. I never wrote anything like this before, and I'm sure I'm not going to write about this anymore because nobody wants their life to be like a drama, but readers like drama, but we writers, we don't really want our life like drama. So, but after experiencing this, yes, I started to see the new layers of journey. It's not only journey of physics, but also journey of giving meaning of our living and dying. Thank you.
That brings us very neatly to landscape and with travel. And of course, a lot of your book, Kim, is about maps. Position Doubtful, it is about mapping landscapes. But that's not really landscapes, is it? Can you tell us a bit about...
Well, I guess, and this takes us, there's a few people here today who were in my workshop yesterday, and we talked a lot about metaphor. And of course, that's mapping is an archetypal metaphor. Hang on, I think I might have just mixed them a bit then. But I'd just actually like to quickly reiterate on something Agustinus said, though, which is about, giving life and death meaning. And of course, that's a very strong strand in my book about, all the women it's dedicated to died during the years that I was travelling out there. And part of the reason for the book was also to honour those lives and what they'd meant to me and how my life had intersected with theirs. So, yes, I think that's a very important part of that process. So mapping and landscape, there's the business of the literal map of a landscape, and the term position doubtful, actually, you'll find it on the topographical maps that were the only available maps for a long time of large parts of territory in the desert, because they were only on aeronautical maps, and so where there hadn't been ground surveys, and there was just sort of either, someone had seen something from a plane and said it's down there somewhere, or a, wandering prospector had said, yes, there's this, waterhole in the vicinity of, those hills. So maps had this term position doubtful all over them. And including my first map my dad used going out to the Tanami, and it had lodged very early for me as a fantastic metaphor of placing oneself within this particular country and landscape. So I did always know that would be the title of my second book. But I guess the business of landscape, I can't remember ever not feeling profoundly affected by and a part of the landscape that certainly of my early years, which is this landscape. And I guess one of the things I wanted to bring through in my book was that we can all feel that very profound. I think landscapes affect our psyche. I think a different kind of landscape shapes who we become, and that as a white Australian, one can still have that very, very deep attachment and feeling for and feel, in a sense, almost physically integrated in landscape, and that does not in any way disenfranchise, an indigenous relationship to landscape. I think, in fact, that it's what helps us to, understand where each other are coming from. And it's certainly been one of the things that there has never been any querying of why I would want to go back to that desert country that I visit all the time, because, as far as Aboriginal people are concerned, of course you go back. Country calls you back. And in a way, going back to me working out how I could build a sustainable way of going back, the fact that I was doing it much more initially because of the landscape than, the people were there and one had to negotiate with them, black or white, as part of the landscape. But that wasn't the primary thing that took me back. That only became, that slowly sort of took it over. And I guess that strand throughout the book of mapping my relationship to landscape, both literally and metaphorically, that just continues to be. I'm deeply fascinated by it. I don't feel like I've worked it out yet. There's a chapter in the book where I actually talk about the different ways in which, say, Aboriginal artists paint landscape, and I'm talking more of the more traditional topographical aerial type of approach, and how the Western way of looking at landscape is the sort of, the standing back and kind of the perspectival view, and kind of, thinking about those as ways of seeing and what they imply. Look, it's as you can tell, I'm still kind of, teasing that one out. I feel like there's a lot more to think through. So, the book is as coherent as I could make it, but from my point of view, it's absolutely unfinished business for me.
So there's going to be more books.
Not necessarily more books, but certainly, more teasing out. I mean, I am a visual artist as well, and some of these things I think you can't work out intellectually. You know, you work them out through a process of making and so on. So, I mean, that's why I do both, is that there are certain things that, you know, writing can't do, there are certain things that visual art can't do, but when you play, well, I mean, I guess mapping, you do both, you know. Mapping is where you have the visual and the words, and that's probably why I find it such a compelling, lots of my paintings have words in them, and I hope my writing is full of images, you know.
Agustinus, you're a travel writer and a photographer.
Yeah.
How do you see the interplay of how important are the photos and the words? How do you weigh those up?
The photos and the words.
Yeah, especially when it comes to describing landscape or when you're travelling.
Oh yeah, but this is a benefit of writing in the current era, in the digital era, that we can remember the visual image with photography and then with the digital photography. And for travel writing, basically it's writing about place. But there is another layer that you cannot do only with the visual things, because in travel writing, if you only simply write about place, then you cannot beat Wikipedia. Wikipedia has a lot of places over there, but the most important is about the soul of the place, the experience, the taste, the texture, the feeling, and that one cannot be replaced by photography. And for me, travel writing we need to be able to convey not only for our experiences, but also about the soul and the spirit of the places, and this comes from the story of the people. But there is also another side of it, because there is no so-called objectivity in seeing our landscape, because how we see our landscape depends on something in our inside, something inside us, something inside the inner side of us. So when I look back on the collection of the landscapes and the places I have been, I realized that there is a kind of attraction to me from borders and minority. Most of my travel brought me to the borders. Either it's physical border or psychological border that draw me to the this identity or that identity, this type of minority or that type of minority. But it also reflected a big question that is inside me, that I was raised as a diaspora in Indonesia, where the question of home always haunted me since my childhood, because I was also discriminated because of my identity. So the question of who am I, where I belong, these two questions affected me to be attracted to a certain type of landscape. Not many people really would like to go to border. Borders are dangerous places, but somehow for me it has a magnet. I always want to go to the borders. I want to see the life of the both sides of the borders, and I realized this is affected by the inner me, the me that I need so much of contemplation to understand why I see the landscape and why I see the people and why I see the environment around me in this kind of perspective.
That's another big similarity between the two of you, is you say, you were of Chinese ethnicity in Indonesia and felt out of place, and then went to China to study and still felt out of place.
Yeah.
Whereas Kim, you were raised amongst an Aboriginal community, feeling I'm not really part of that. Is that how you felt? Or?
Well, I was very tiny, but I obviously did, because I spent most of my time trying to change my skin colour. Mud, boot polish, paint, whatever. You know, my mum was dragging me home and scrubbing me clean. Beetroot once, actually, too. That was really scary. They thought it was blood. So
your poor mum, I can imagine.
Actually, the Aboriginal woman who was my skin mother thought my dad had beaten me, and she took to him with a broom, you know. Yeah.
So coming from this perspective, how do you feel about homecoming? Because your books are both about homecoming.
Look, I have been thinking about this, knowing this question would be asked, and I'm never quite sure how to answer it, except to say that I think I'm one of the very fortunate people who I feel very at home in broad stretch of Australia. I feel very much an Australian at home in my country. But that comprises a track, I think, with a series of places along it. Where I live at the moment, it's a terrific location. I have a great studio. It's somewhere I can retreat and make art and so on. This is down near Canberra. And then, but I don't physically feel a connection to it in the way that I feel, because I usually drive up here, and once I hit the big red sandhills and with the desert oaks on them, it literally affects me physically. And then you sort of come in through the hills into Alice, and in a sense this is the sort of crossing point for me. I usually stop, I catch up with friends. Of course I have many layers of experiences of Alice Springs. Every part of my life I've actually been here at some point. And then I go on out to the Tanami and the southeast Kimberley, into that what is predominantly now an Aboriginal world. And there are places there too, that there's a little place like Ruth or Monkarupa, which is, if anyone says, oh, where's the place your sort of spirit sits, that's it. I usually stop there. I describe in Position Doubtful a process I actually go through where I sort of leave, Kim, who has various kinds of, introspection and whatever, at Lake Ruth, and Nabarula comes along and she gets me, she's a more robust sort of larger than life, somebody who can actually deal with that, the environment I'm going into, where I, any self-doubt in that world and you're just undone straight away, There's plenty of things to sort of deal with without undermining yourself. But so it's like I suppose each place a different part of myself lives in. So, I feel like I have many homes across the continent, and each one allows, the traveller, the person, I love the driving, I love that process of coming out of New South Wales, and then, South Australia is like just another place entirely. You could be on the moon in a way. And sneaking in, I've got little campsites I know that I can usually time myself to get to, 20 k's south of Kubapedi just before sunset, so you're not going to fall down one of the, mine sites, and there's a great spot you can sort of sneak into and just make camp, and just for that night, that evening and night on every trip, that's home for a minute, the walking around, the revisiting. And so, I think the importance, this is a predominantly urban culture with this astonishing landscape and inland culture. I was thinking today, there's nowhere else that the kinds of conversations that are happening at this Writers' Festival can happen. There is a kind of engagement here. Questions can be asked, more often than not there's an Indigenous person on the panel. There's such a genuine engagement going on here. It's not possible to have those sorts of conversations elsewhere. I have, yesterday's the third time I've been paired with Bruce Pascoe, but the others have all been in, urban settings, and where I have to say I feel incredibly inauthentic. I don't quite know how to have the conversation, because I know I'm there as a safe pair of hands around Indigenous matters, whereas here I can just talk, as Bruce could. It's just a completely different audience. But I keep that alive by constantly having the conversation right across. That stretch is the thing that is, it means there used to be a level of discomfort in both places. I don't actually feel that anymore. I think that discomfort was probably my not knowing how to negotiate it. But, one of the things about getting older, you are much less afraid of various things. I'm looking forward to that point where I'm really not scared of anything.
You're going to be one of those old ladies, aren't
really
you?
Cranky old ladies. Miss Pink. I knew Miss Pink. I was terrified I'd turn into Miss Pink, actually.
I meant to ask it to say, we're in the lovely olive pink gardens. Kim remembers Miss Pink.
I remember being bailed up. I used to ride my Shetland pony down in the Todd, and she'd be walking across, sand shoes, solar topi, raincoat, and she would just harangue me, you know, and it's and then in the library, she was always in the library, and she was always, you know, haranguing somebody in the library, and I can remember.
I think her ghost is still in that
in the library. That's right. And on this hill, you know, she used to come out with her shotgun and, you know, hunt the kids away, and write letters to the local. She was always complaining about somebody. But I remember thinking, you know, and the general sort of town approach was, this is what happens to mad old ladies that never get married, and, you know, they have too many opinions, and, you know, whatever. And I started thinking, don't ever be like that. And now it's like, bring it on, you know, I'm ready. So, yeah, that's nice.
To you, Agustinus. You're a little bit younger.
And quieter.
Have you found your home place yet, and your inner self? Or is the journey continuing?
Yeah, I think I learned this process from the journey, because if we look back, that our whole family journey is shaped by migration. Our ancestors came from southern China, and it was because of the Second World War that the Japanese came to kill the people in the village. So my grandpa was fighting against the Japanese, so he ran away, sneaked away into Indonesia, and then in Indonesia we are shaped by the situation, the anti-communism. So we were our identity is being crushed. So when I was raised during this era, I was raised in the how to say that, dejected or rejected identity. So at that time, my mom always kept telling me the stories from our motherland, saying like, yeah, your home is in motherland, your home is in China, you are not Indonesian. We always, inside the home, we were told by parents that we are Zhongguoren, which means Chinese, mainland Chinese. We never use the word Indonesian. When you use the word Indonesian in Chinese, we use it in derogatory way. For example, don't be lazy. If you are lazy, you will be Indonesian. So this is how our parents teach us at that time. But outside home, we suddenly became a different person, because in the school, we have that moral education, and we have to say we are Indonesian, we are not Chinese. And every time we have to remember ourselves that our identity is only Indonesian. But at the same time, we also being reminded all the time that we are Chinese. So in the school, they taught us to be Indonesian, but outside the schools, the people mock us because of our slanted eyes and yellow skin, and then say like China, China, China. So there's this question: where is actually our home? Where we really belong to? I came to China for the first time in year 2000, and I thought it was homecoming. But the first thing that struck me that it was not homecoming, because I remember when I was a kid, my mom told me that Chinese never spade, but in China everybody spade. So at that time I realized, I asked whether we are the same Chinese from the same ancestors. And also coming to China, they didn't regard me because of my Chinese blood. They just saw my passport, and I'm Indonesian passport. I'm considered as foreign student. I have to stay in the foreign student dormitory. I'm not allowed to bring Chinese guests to come to my room, and we have to live in the all foreigners' place. We are not allowed to even stay in the Chinese housings. So that time it started the urge for me to keep traveling to find where home really means for me. So I went to Central Asia, I went to India, Pakistan, until I arrived in Afghanistan, and I saw the life of the refugees. And I realized that we are also a sort of refugees. We keep traveling, we keep looking place that we can call home. We are trying to plant our seed everywhere, but the rejection and acceptance make us very difficult to find the real home. Until when I arrived to Indonesia, well, it's a full circle journey. The journey on the way, and eventually will bring you home to your original location until you understand what is the real meaning. I talked with my father at that time. My father got stroke. My mother got cancer. So I said to my father, I can fulfill your dream that is to bring you to go back to your homeland, to your motherland. And you know, my father said, no. That is only going to China. This is the homeland. This is Indonesia. And it struck me a lot because my father suffered much more because of his Chinese identity compared to me. He was put in jail because of being Chinese. He was protesting against the government for the anti-Chinese regulations. And he also had so much of bitterness against the regime at that time. But then Indonesia also changed, the regime changed, the Indonesian government started to recognize the rights of the Chinese, and we are now allowed to be as we are. And suddenly my father's concept of home also changed. And I asked about my father because I could not believe this sentence come out from his mouth. So he said to me, everything starts from your heart. If you think that you are if you think that you are minorities, you are forever minorities. But if you think you are second-class citizen, then forever you are second-class citizen. So after he said this, I realized home is not about place. Home is a state of mind. When we start to make peace with our environment, we make peace with our past and future. We live in the present. Everywhere can be your home. Home needs acceptance of both sides. You accept your environment first, and then you cannot ask your environment to keep accepting you if you don't try first to accept your environment. You have to blend in with the environment, and then to make peace with the environment. Then you start making your home, because home is not everywhere. Home is here. Thank you.
Well, I might open the floor to questions now. So we've got a bit of time for questions. Anyone going to get the ball rolling? Beautiful Danny's going to bring you a mic. The festival director.
Stand up where I am. Sorry, I'm stepping away from the feedback machine. Kim, I just drove up here from Tassie. I've been reading your book in a variety of outback locations here, South Australia, Queensland. And I'm into maps, and it struck me that you don't actually show any maps of the places you go in the book. Is that deliberate? Apart from the excerpts of maps and your artwork, but there's nothing that is like a kind of traditional, distribution map of where you've been.
No, and in fact, that's probably a publishing oversight that there isn't a map at the beginning that just says this is where this story is set. It didn't occur to me, but you're right. There aren't any maps that are just a straightforward traditional map. I personally, of course, don't use them, those sorts of maps, because I kind of go back to the same places. And when I'm not going somewhere that I've been before, it's usually with, some traditional owners or, people who know the country. And I guess that's the one kind of map that to me is not that interesting. The map that just designates, if you go from here to there, there are certain things along the way. To me, the kinds of maps I talk about and write about are the maps that, as I say, maps I invent, and there are those maps I've found, maps I've stolen, and they're, the notion of a map as a sort of work in progress to trick you into going somewhere that you sort of imagine there's going to be something a bit predictable, and so it just sets you in motion, and then you end up somewhere completely you hadn't expected, and you have to you reorient yourself. So in a sense you map both cognitively and physically. I do have maps in the pocket of the car, but the dog ate quite a few of them a few years back. Just occasionally, I got terribly lost last year. I took a slightly different route from Port Augusta, and there's this network of little ways you can get from, across the bottom of South Australia. And it was cloudy, and I actually doubled back on myself, I was like, I don't have a map. But once I'm out here, I'm fine,
More questions from anyone?
This is partly a comment, really, as well as a question in a way to Kim, is I find your comments about travelling up here when you're alone, that's really how I used to travel. I found it very good to be able to just make my own way and camp off the road somewhere. And but then one of the things I found with Aboriginal people was they'd be concerned if you're travelling alone. And that was, there's something I think you have in your book, you indicate how often you do travel with Aboriginal people. But I found it interesting, though it was 50 degrees out west, and they made sure I had someone with me in case something went wrong. Just wondered about that sort of thought for you, Kim.
I think if I heard that right, it's about travelling alone. And do I have concerns about that? The only times I feel a little bit uneasy are when I'm on the bitumen, usually, say, Culgra South, from Culgra South. I'm pretty careful about where I sort of throw the swag. But particularly once I'm on the Tanami and getting out into the remoter areas, no, I have never felt any concerns. Occasionally, I mean, I was actually on the Tanami at the same time as, what's his name, who killed Peter Falconio. We would have crossed, I learned later, but he was clearly moving fast and didn't stop. But really, I think... you know, for most people, I think their fear of the desert and of being alone in the desert is it's some kind of investing in the landscape, something, you know, that is you know, it's projected onto it. I mean, lots of Aboriginal people worry about me being on my own because they would never do that, because for them the landscape is full of all kinds of, you know, dangerous entities. I know there's been times when they've got really cross with me for dragging my swag a long way away, and I've had to say, but you guys snore so much I won't get any sleep, you know, so I'm forgiven in that case. And there's also a kind of understanding that, you know, I'm a mad white fella, and there are some places they say, well, just don't go there on your own, being white won't protect you. But in a lot of other places it's like, okay, whatever, you know. But in practical ways, look, I think it's probably, you know, just the chances of getting you know, injured or getting into some sort of difficulty in a very, very, you know, built-up environment are much greater than in the desert. And I take the normal precautions. I let people know when I'm travelling. I still don't carry a sat phone, probably should. But but you know, look, I lived out there. My mum used to drive the Tanami in a beat-up old Zephyr station wagon in the 1960s, and with all us kids aboard, and the doors roped shut because the road had sort of shaken it loose, and it was just, you know, people knew you were on the road. You let them know if you didn't turn up within, you know, 24 hours of when you said you would. Somebody came looking, and I still kind of work on that principle. And I'm hoping it will get me through, you know. So.
There's a question right up the front here.
Augustinus, I'm curious, if I've understood you correctly, I'm curious as to, you've gone from Indonesia to China,
Yeah.
and then you want to, in a sense, find your home or find something, and you go into Central Asia.
Yeah.
What drew... and I love Central Asia, but what drew you to Central Asia and not somewhere else? Was it just that it's next door, or...?
Originally, in the beginning, I was a student in China with a very limited budget because my parents never support me of traveling. So I have very strained budget. So the only places that I could go easily from China is Central Asia. But then I fell in love with Central Asia since the first visit. I went to Afghanistan, and I was fascinated with the Silk Road history and then the tradition, and it made me also interested by the concept of the borders. The Central Asian countries were created under the Soviet Union, and first the Soviets created the nation. They create what is Kazakh, what is Tajik, what is Uzbek, what is Kyrgyz. Then for every nation they create a country. So Kazakhstan for the Kazakhs, Kyrgyzstan for the Kyrgyz, Uzbekistan for the Uzbeks, and etc. So and Central Asia is also the paradise of border lovers. Over there, you you have crazy border here and there. You have a small Tajikistan village completely inside Kyrgyzstan, a small Kyrgyzstan dot completely inside Uzbekistan, and one Uzbekistan village inside Kyrgyzstan but inhabited by the Tajiks. So it's crazy. And then sometimes the border also passes through people's houses. That the kitchen is in Uzbekistan, and then the bedroom in Kyrgyzstan. And then in one room sometimes they use bulbs, like one bulb with electricity from Uzbekistan, one bulb with electricity for Kyrgyzstan, to ensure that they never had total blackout. but even this invisible border, such invisible that you can go to another country 100 times a day, a border is created here because people who live in Uzbekistan side and the Kyrgyzstan side from the same alley, they were originally Uzbek, but the people who are in the Uzbek side, they have to go to Uzbek school to venerate Amir Timur, Tamerlane, to venerate the Silk Road history, when the neighbors on the opposite side of the alley has to go to Kyrgyz school to venerate the nomadic history, and then to learn Kyrgyz as a national language, even the Uzbek. And then you go to another village, it's totally the opposite, that you have a village of Uzbekistan, completely inside Kyrgyzstan, but inhabited by the Kyrgyz. So why people has to have this kind of faith? Because we never choose. Most of us cannot choose our borders. We never choose to be born as people from this country or from that country. But at the end, this kind of faith that we don't choose have decided our lives. Sometimes decided totally that people from the opposite side of the river, like in Afghanistan and Tajikistan, the river is the border, 20 meters wide of the river, but the river separates life of both sides for at least 100 years different. And this is something that they don't choose. It's something imposed from the top to them. And then the border was drawn by foreigners thousands of kilometers away who never even considered there are people living there. And by realizing the reality of Central Asia, I also realized our reality as a colonized country, like Indonesia got independent from Dutch, and that all of the borders were also inherited by the Dutch, and that's why we end up with such a big countries and also with so many problems. And this is border. So I got so much of reflection on the issues of identity, minority, and borders from Central Asia, and that's why I keep traveling there. Thank you.
One up the back there.
Hello, a question for Kim. It's in relation to the name of the book. The book is positioned Doubtful, and probably indigenous people will never consider this as a position doubtful. They basically know the landscape sufficiently well not to get lost and not to have this debate about is this the position or not. Would you like to comment on this?
Well, I think that was true. I would say that it actually isn't anymore. I think that many things have been changed. I mean, it's very interesting, and this is around, imposed borders and so on as well. For instance, in the Tanami, mining is a very major, it's an industry. It's also a major source of income for a lot of the traditional owners out there. In order to establish where mining could take place and what had to be avoided, the country had to be conceptualised differently than it had been in the past, so that those borders could be locked down, which was never the case in the past. What then happened, of course, is as you know, those sort of first contact generation has died out, and some of the information hasn't been passed on. Arguments about whose land is whose, you know, and the way in which it's sort of passed on, rights are passed on. All of that is much more complex now, I think, than it used to be. And I have actually been out with, you know, elderly people who have looked around and said, you know, I think that waterhole's over there, but I'm not sure anymore. So you know, although obviously I've also been out with people where there's no visible kind of landmarks of any kind, and they know exactly where they are. So it's certainly not to, you know, undermine that phenomenal capacity people have to know where they are. But I do think that I think the position doubtful can actually be extended into the Aboriginal realm now too.
Oh, question right here.
This is for Agustina. Just listening to your story of borders is fascinating, and I guess we're all familiar now with lots of borders that cause crazy outcomes. On Friday night, you also talked about the tension of us as individuals, that we create borders. We often call them, we create our boundaries and so on. Have you got any reflections on how you hold the tension of the nonsense often of borders, but also a sense of a personal need and perhaps a communal need for boundaries?
Yeah, I think this is the questions when we saw the absurdity of border, and we keep asking why border ever existed. But if you see from the human civilization history, border is part of our human nature. We create border to give us a sense of security, right? We make house with the fences. Why we make house with fences? It's also a border. We want security for ourselves. So and if you see with the civilization, many wars are also about borders. When in the nomadic time, most wars broke out is about who control the water and the river and the grassland, and then in the desert it's about the oasis. So border is not only that give us so much of problem, but it's also in the opposite side. It also give us protection. Without border, we will feel insecure. If in the concept of demolishing border, I think it's kind of dangerous if you enforcing to demolish border. We experience this as a Chinese Indonesian when we are forced to be Indonesian by the government try to make us forget on Chinese roots by not allowing us having Chinese culture and preserving the Chinese language. It's to dissolve our Chinese border. But what is the effect? The effect is the Chinese identity is even getting stronger among the Chinese at that time. We feel more Chinese than Indonesian because we are forced to do that. And then the other reason is border doesn't create the differences. The differences are marked by the border. So when you dissolve the border, there is a tendency that many of the differences would disappear because of having no border at all. You see in Indonesia have 300 ethnic groups, 700 languages, but most of the languages are dying now because everybody's speaking the one dominant language. Many of the diversity is getting lost in Indonesia because one and bigger single identity is getting to dominate everybody. So my contemplation about border is not to fight against border because that is inhuman. That is part of our human nature. But to understand border and then to see beyond the border that even people with the different borders are the same as us. This is the concept of universalist humanity. That by doing this, okay, we have the physical borders are still there, but at least we already reduce the psychological border in us. We will realize that people from different religions are not terrorists. We realize that people with the different ethnic groups are not evils, but we realize that they're both the same like us. We cry for the same thing, we laugh for the same joy, and we are pursuing for the same dream, and eventually we will go to the same ending. We will all having the same fear of death. So by seeing the similarities, and instead of emphasizing of differences, at least you already reduce the psychological border inside the brain. Thank you.
There's time for one more question. We got one more question out there? We might have run out. Oh, quick question? Okay.
Augustina, I'm curious as to whether your earlier books are going to be translated into English or not.
Oh, yes. Okay. I don't know. I don't know even, because for translating this book, it took me 2 years. So if I keep, because it's not simple translation. Today in the translation panel, we talk about this translation from one language to another language. That, in fact, it turned out to be totally writing for me for this book to be translated to English. But I might write another book, especially on border, based on all of my contemplation from all of these years, including the previous travel. Then maybe in the future it will come into English. But now I'm doing a new project, which is, I suppose, this one I write already in Indonesian that is directly translatable to English, so I don't need to do some rewrites. And this is also related about border, about what is the meaning of Indonesian border. And maybe you can see some of the contemplation on border in this book, the next project. So yeah, please wait for that. Thank you.
What's your next project? I'll ask quickly the last question. Kim, what's your next project?
I'm working on a book of essays that will flesh out, Garia Like Tueras will be the lead essay in it, but I need to build around it. So in fact, coming back to Alice has just given me several quite compelling ideas to pursue. So
that's bound to be bestseller.
In Alice Springs anyway.
Okay, so that concludes our final session of the NT Writers Festival. This is the festival director, Danny, by the way. This is the fabulous Danny Powell here, who's absolutely exhausted. But there is one last event, and it's free, and it's in the cafe. So, and it's a chance for you to mix, debrief, get an autograph, get a book signed, buy one of the last books that Agustinus has in his backpack, so he doesn't have to drag it all the way to Darwin before he goes back to Indonesia. And of course, there'll be, at the cafe, we'll be thanking the lovely Danny properly and all the other people in the team. The cafe is serving food until 7, I believe, and there's going to be a bar open so people can buy drinks to celebrate. Next year's NT Writers Festival is going to be in Darwin, so I'm hoping to see you all there, and I'm remembering your faces because I'm the Darwin one. So big thanks to Kim and Agustinus, and we'll see you all in the cafe or the bar. Oh, Danny's going to say one thing.
Can I say one thing? Maybe 3 things. 1, thank you for your response as a community. 2, let's continue in the spirit of Iwaratara as a community. And 3, if you were uncomfortable at some times because this festival became so big, that was amazing for us, but we were very small in numbers. So sorry for any discomfort. Obviously, we need to make a marquee or something bigger. We've got small venues, but we want to stay in the gardens because we love the gardens and we love the staff here have been fantastic. And write to us in Alice and tell us what you thought. But the last thing I want to say is that if you didn't get a chance, please just walk in the gardens and walk through the trees and be with this country and look for the poetry hanging, because the poetry has been strung in the trees by all the participating writers of this festival, and it's been woven into the trees by Anna Sathasaringa, and I acknowledge you again for that. And read, because it won't be there forever. Thank you.